Now I turn the program over to Ms. Sarah Cohen, Director of Jewish National Fund's Speaker Bureau. Sarah?
Thank you, Preston, for the warm introduction. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to Jewish National Fund USA's reading series hosted by Stephen Shalowitz, featuring Ben N. Freeman to discuss Jewish pride, rebuilding a people. Author Ben Freeman, inspired by his experiences with LGBTQ Pride Plus, aims to educate, inspire, and empower Jewish people to reject the shame of anti-Semitism imposed on Jews by the non-Jewish world, as well as non-Jewish perceptions on what it is meant to be a Jew. It's an honor to introduce Stephen Shalowitz. Stephen is the host of Jewish National Fund USA's IsraelCast podcast and the One Way Ticket Show podcast. He is a JNF USA New York board member and on JNF USA's social media committee, and invites you to connect with him on all social media at Stephen Shalowitz. Born in Scotland, Ben is a gay Jewish author and internationally renowned educator focusing on Jewish identity, combating anti-Semitism, and raising awareness of the Holocaust. His first book, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People, was released in February 2021, and due to high demand, it's in its second print edition. Currently based in Hong Kong, Ben now heads up the humanities team at an American international school and lectures on anti-Semitism at Hong Kong universities. Through his work, he aims to educate, inspire, and empower both Jewish and non-Jewish people from all over the world. Follow his work across all major social media platforms at Ben M. Freeman. Stephen and Ben, thank you. I now turn the program over to you.
All right, thank you so much for that, Sarah, and good morning, Ben, to you. 早上好, 早安.
Good morning, good evening, everyone.
Right, well, listen, thank you so much for waking up so early in the morning. It is just past 7 a.m. in the morning. So I'm glad that you went into, as we say, hair and makeup before you came on this Zoom call. I'm sure you had to wake up again at the crack of dawn. You look great. And so really, we thank you. And I know that you're all energized to talk about your book. Again, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People. Really, congratulations on it. Hopefully everybody can see it right here. And I just want to say for everybody, once again, thanks to everybody for joining us. As Sarah and Preston mentioned, Ben is our current guest on the IsraelCast podcast. It's episode 120. I encourage everybody to check it out, jnf.org/IsraelCast, or you can check it out wherever you like to get your podcast. Just search for IsraelCast. I believe Sarah's going to put or has put a link to it in the chat. So do check it out because we're going to be getting to other topics that we didn't have time to get to during that conversation. But I do want to touch on several of the topics, of course, that we did talk about in our podcast interview. And first and foremost, really, Ben, is I want you to take a step back and share with our listeners and everybody that's joining us why you wrote the book, what was the impetus for writing the book, and why now?
Firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to speak to you again, Stephen. So I wrote the book because I realized, based on my experiences with LGBTQ plus pride, that the Jewish community needed its own pride movement. In the LGBTQ plus community, we speak about shame. We speak about the impact of LGBTQ plus phobia on us. We understand how it impacts us psychologically. And in the Jewish community, I don't think we understand that as well. We spend a lot of time discussing our dead, which is obviously hugely important. And as a Holocaust educator, something I feel very passionately about. But I think we miss a trick when we don't start, or when we don't have discussions about, well, what is the impact of all of this hate on us? How does it impact how we view ourselves? What does it mean to be a Jew in the non-Jewish world? What does it mean to be a Jew in the diaspora? And you know, as I said, I had been on my own journey to LGBTQ plus pride, and I'd understood what it meant to go on a pride journey, and it really involved work. And then in 2018, I joined Twitter specifically to join the fight against Jeremy Corbyn. So Jeremy Corbyn was the former leader of the British Labour Party who was involved in the Labour anti-Semitism crisis. So he was accused by the Jewish community. He was accused, sorry, I'm just making sure, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, actually.
Okay, so Jeremy Corbyn was accused by the Jewish community in Britain of being an anti-Semite, and it started this war basically. And I realized that the British Jewish community really embodied Jewish pride, which was really wonderful to see. They came together, they stood as one, and they fought this existential threat. But I also saw high-profile, often left-wing Jews who were unable to call it for what it was. And they were suffering from what I call the hangover of the keep your head down policy, which, you know, the unofficial policy in the Jewish world of just keep your head down, just get on with it. And actually know that it didn't work. And that instills shame in us. We're allowed to advocate for ourselves. We should be proud of ourselves, particularly when we receive such negative messaging from the world around us. So that was really the impetus and the inspiration and why I wrote this book at this specific time.
Indeed. Now, I know you're going to be a future guest on Jewish National Fund's Conversations on Zionism, Reclaiming the Narrative. And for everybody that's joining us, it's a year-long campaign. It kicked off, in fact, last night, where Russell Robinson was in conversation with Gil Troy, American presidential historian and Zionist activist. And just a word about that, because the goal of the campaign is to reclaim the beauty, the inspiration, shall we say, the diversity, inclusivity of Zionism, and give people the tools to understand that we can no longer allow others to define what Zionism is, just like we should not have others define what Judaism is. And there were 2 points, actually, then that Gil raised last night. And I want you to talk about them because I found that they were very much echoed and mirrored in your book. And the first thing is this notion, indeed, that we can't let others define the narrative for us. We have to define the narrative for ourselves.
Absolutely, I think that's hugely important. And I think that it's something that not all Jews are particularly comfortable with, because it's actually a new idea, really, we're talking about it again. We haven't really been discussing our identity in that way for a long time, but I think it's hugely important. And I think we have to just kind of take a little bit of a step back and understand our history from a bird's eye perspective. Let's look at what it has meant to be Jewish for about 2,000 or 3,000 years. We were a colonized people in our own homeland, so we were not equal players with those who we were interacting with. So there was a huge power imbalance. And then in the diaspora, it was the same situation. We are a minority. So there's 14.7 million Jews in the world, which really means numerically we're a minority, not just in terms of how we're treated. So when we interact with a wider world who doesn't understand our identity, it's very easy for them to sweep us aside, to speak over us, to define what it means to be Jewish. And that in turn leads us to misunderstand our own identity. And I think, we particularly saw it in Europe following the French Revolution. Language was hugely important in the 19th century, and it really defined belonging. And the French and the German and these other kind of modern nations that were forming said to the Jews, we can't have nations within nations. You have to be French, full stop. We're not going to have a Jewish nation within a French nation. And this was also really connected again to this idea of language and which languages we were speaking. So the Jews said, okay, fine, we'll be French. So we totally changed and warped who we were. We became just a religious group. We no longer were a people, no longer were a nation. And that is not an authentic understanding of our identity. But when we allow them to dictate our terms, it leads us to misunderstand ourselves. And also, I think, really suffer from internalized anti-Jewish racism, which I think is a huge problem in our community. So I think us defining our narratives is hugely important.
Okay, internal anti-Jewish racism, which is different than from being a self-hating Jew. Is that correct?
I mean, essentially, they're the same.
I don't like that term.
Yes,
yeah.
Precisely. And I mean, essentially, they're the same idea. So when you say a self-hating Jew and when I say internalized anti-Semitism, we're really talking about the same thing. But I think language is hugely important. And one of the reasons that Jews internalize their anti-Semitism is that we look for the problem within us. We don't say to the wider world, hey, the way you guys have treated us for the last 2,000+ years is terrible. This is your problem. We think the problem lies within us. And that is really what the term self-hatred implies. It implies that we have a flaw, we have a fault, and we spend a disproportionate amount of time talking about it. Whereas that's not the case. Our Jewishness is not a flaw, it's not a fault. And very simply, we have literally internalized it. We've absorbed these ideas from the world around us. We don't hate ourselves. The non-Jewish world hates us.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm going to get to Gil Troy's second point that I wanted to share. in a short while, because it doesn't pertain to what we're talking about right now. But what you just said is very interesting, because one thing that you do point out in the book is that anti-Semitism isn't a Jewish problem. It's everybody else's problem that impacts us, okay? Which I think is a very interesting way of looking at it. But there was something that you said in our conversation, Ben M. Freeman, Ben Maxwell Freeman, we know what the M stands for after our last conversation. There was something you said in our interview on the podcast that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. And it's really this notion of how, how we as Jews internalize that anti-Semitism, and how we then, how we're supposed to react to that anti-Semitism. Because for me, it's still a question of what's in it for those anti-Semites to give up their anti-Semitism. Yeah. Because, I don't want to get into American politics here, but, a lot of those people that were founders of BLM are very anti-Semitic. They're very anti-Israel. They're virulent anti-Zionists. People don't like to talk about that, but we're going to call them out. Yeah. So what's in it for them to give it up?
Yeah,
and I still don't understand. And how do you even make them give it up? Or is there just a segment of society that we just say, you know what, they're a lost cause, that we have to look at that middle ground and see those people that we can actually really just affect?
Yeah, and I think that's it. And I think it's we don't like to say it like that, because I think for some people it feels like admitting defeat, but it's not defeat. We have no control over the other. We have no control over the non-Jewish world, contrary to what they believe. If we did, there probably would be less Jew hatred. But we try over and over and over again to reason with these people. And I'm talking about the people who really seem to be hateful. And I'm not talking about the middle ground. And that's not to say the middle ground does not have its own issues, but absolutely most people can be educated out of a specific perspective. So they can be led to understand that their bias against Jews is rooted in this 2,000 years of hate. But absolutely, there are people we're never going to be able to touch. And I also think ultimately, we're never going to be able to defeat anti-Jewish racism. We're never going to be able to defeat it. If it's to be defeated, the non-Jewish world has to set upon that task. What we do when we fight is keep it at bay. And we inspire each other, we empower each other to know we deserve better. This is wrong the way we're treated. What this, founder of BLM has said is wrong. BDS is wrong. Anti-Zionism is racism. And we say that to influence, for sure, the middle ground, but also to educate, inspire, and empower each other. But absolutely, unfortunately, just as it's the same with every other group of people, every other minority, if people are really hateful, there's not much we can do about that. And it's not about admitting defeat. It's about understanding where are our resources best well spent. And we also have to turn inwards and cultivate ourselves and understand that this hate is not our problem. It becomes our problem, but it's not actually ours.
Right. And just as a footnote, I'm talking about the BLM organization. I'm not talking about the general notion of BLM. Okay.
For sure, of course.
I just want to make that very clear for everybody. So that's actually a nice jumping off point, going back to something that Gil Troy said last night, and I want you to comment on it. It was a bit of an aha moment for me also, because he said, oftentimes people in the Jewish world, the Israel advocacy world, they say, I don't have time to go to a Shabbat dinner. I don't have time to go to services. I don't have time to celebrate this or that other holiday, or to do something that's Jewish related, because I have to go and I have to fight BDS. I have to go and I have to fight anti-Zionism. I have to go and I have to fight this, that, and the other. But he's making the point, no, your priority should be celebrating your Jewishness, right? And I want you to comment on that, because that's really at the heart of what your book is all about.
Absolutely. There's so much joy in our peoplehood.
Yeah.
There's so much to celebrate. There's so much beauty. And there's not one way to be Jewish, right? We're not going to force people to go to shul. We're not going to force people to keep kosher. But there's so many ways for us to actively interact with our Jewishness. And yes, that should be one of our priorities, absolutely. Because if all we do is spend our time combating BDS and combating the racists, then where's the joy? What are we fighting for? We have beauty and we have history and we have tradition that we need to be understanding, we need to be cultivating. And I think he's absolutely right. And I actually think that the untethering of Jewish people from active Jewish life has had kind of devastating consequences on our mental health, as well as on our perceptions of what Jewishness is, right? We're not just this pitiful minority who's always up against the other. And yes, that might be true in some cases, and maybe it is true, but we're so much more than that. And we're not just here to fight the racists, we're here to love and celebrate ourselves and to spread that Jewish pride all over the world.
And Ben, how do you get people to act? How do you get people, as I said, the Zionism campaign to reclaim the narrative that Jewish National Fund has just launched? How do you really get people to take action and embrace their heritage, the Jewish peoplehood? Like, what are some of your thoughts on that? Because I think I really want to leave people, those of us that are joining us here tonight, with some real action steps.
Well, I think the first step is education. We have to really understand who we are. Who are the Jewish people? What are we? Where did we come from?
But I'm going to interrupt you right there. But how do you make people care about the education?
Okay. So it's about, we have to have these conversations. We have to be having these conversations across, particularly social media. I mean, these events are really wonderful, but the work that is being done on social media is really important, because not everyone will be coming to a JNF USA event. Not everyone will be coming to a Wider Bridge event, say. But most people have Instagram or Twitter, and we're starting to see a groundswell. We're starting to see a change where people do care. People are starting to say, I am proud to be Jewish. And what it takes is some brave individuals standing up and saying, I love being Jewish, I'm proud of being Jewish. So it's really about being, you know, a role model for those around you. And that's how we get people to care. And we get people to care kind of in a more in-depth way by educating them, and by educating in a way which is non-judgmental. Sometimes people can be made to feel less than because they don't know something. That's not what this is about. We're also not saying there's one way to be Jewish. People get to celebrate their Jewishness in whatever way they like, and people get to be taken into this community in an empathetic way, which educates them and doesn't make them feel less than because they might not know something to begin with. So it's about creating a global movement that's intergenerational and sustainable.
Can we talk about social media and just popular culture just for a moment? Because
Sure.
you know, there was a Pew survey of 2019, a Pew study that said that 80% of all tweets from American adults come from the top 10% of tweeters, okay? So let that sit in your brain for a second, let that sink in. 6 in 10 adults on Twitter say they are Democrats or lean toward the Democratic Party, compared with 52% of all Americans, okay? So I mean, on social media, how then do you change that narrative? Because, and again, I don't want to get into American politics here, but I mean, we've seen how the far left, I'm saying the far left, okay, has viewed the Jewish people and Zionism in Israel of late.
I mean, I would say it's the left. I think it is a left problem. And I think that we have to be clear about this. It isn't just a far left problem. It really is across the board now. And that's obviously generally speaking. But
listen, I wanted you to say it, Ben, not me.
And I identify as someone who's center left, but the left has a huge problem. And there was a certain Jewish American leader not long ago who said, now is the time to recognize that the left has a problem on anti-Semitism. That is quite frankly ludicrous that in 2021, now is the time. The time was 10 years ago. But anyway, I digress. We changed the narrative on social media, or we try to change the narrative by having conversations, by creating a community, by educating people. And it really is simply the fact of like, did you know that the Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel? Here's some evidence, because we have a responsibility as people who are on an online platform, who are educating, to evidence what we're saying. We're not going to be like people who just put statements out into the world and, you know, don't give any explanation as to why that might be. And I think it's also about engaging respectfully with people. And listen, this is hard, and I also fall foul of this. But if someone asks a question in good faith, we should answer them. Sometimes it can be hard to differentiate what's good faith and what's not, because the abuse is like a tsunami often. But it's really about being strong, being loud, being public, finding a community. And that is one of the beauties of social media, is that we now have been given an unprecedented opportunity to connect with Jews around the world. Like, I'm a Scottish Jew living in Hong Kong, you're in New York City, and we're having our second conversation because of social media and the internet. So it's kind of remarkable. So it's about kind of forming our community, bringing people in, spreading the good vibes, spreading the pride, educating people, and doing events like this. And we also have to understand, and not to be a negative Nelly, but social media is a numbers game.
Yeah.
And Bella Hadid, who is a famous supermodel who has famously made anti-Jewish comments, she has more followers than there are Jews in the world. So we have to understand the reach that we have is limited, but it doesn't mean we're going to stop trying. It doesn't mean we're going to stop fighting. And we're not going to demand acceptance or allyship. We're not going to ask for it. We're just going to state our claim to it and inspire other people to do the same thing.
And where do you fall then in terms of popular culture and Jewish depictions of Jews in popular culture? I'm thinking of, for example, on the one hand, we have Shtisel, which is, I think, just beautiful. I can't get enough of it, right? You know, but then we have Unorthodox, and then we have this new whatever that show is called, with that woman that runs the modeling agency, which I think is horrible. And if I were to tell you what I really thought of it, I probably would never be asked back to host one of these reading series events. But like, where do you fall on that? Because, I mean, again, these are Jews that are behind it.
Yeah, I think it's terrible. And I think, you know, listen, one story about people wanting to leave the Orthodox community, fine, it's a reality, but it's the only narrative we hear about the Orthodox community, and it's one of the only narratives we hear about Jews. And I find it, quite frankly, to be revolting, and I find it to be rooted in internalized anti-Jewish racism, and it's absorbing these ideas. And we specifically saw this in the 19th century, that the Eastern European Jews were the ones who were considered to be bad Jews because they were archaic, they were Orthodox, they weren't integrated, they weren't assimilated. Is that not what this is? That the good, secular, left-leaning Jew, they're good, but the Orthodox Jew, they're bad. And listen, we can critique. I'm a gay man, I will critique aspects of the Orthodox community, but I will always defend them because they're still Jews. And to put out narratives that never celebrate their beauty, never celebrate that they often are some of the reasons that our community has survived and our traditions survive, and just to demonize them for a non-Jewish audience, I find to be really revolting.
You know, I was by Times Square the other day, and there was a big billboard of this show, and there was the woman, the character, I can't remember her name, you know, and then her kids, and then one of them that I guess is religious was wearing a Star of David, and you have this big Star of David on this billboard, and it just was so unsettling, really. I just thought, that's a real, you know, it's a real shanda. It is what it is in my book. I'm glad we've gone there, because one of the things that you pointed out in the book, which I thought was really interesting, among many things which are interesting in the book, by the way, congrats again on it, is John Barry's fourfold model, how minorities interact with communities. And can you just take that off? Because I think it's a very interesting way of framing, in some ways, what happened to segments of the Jewish community in the West.
Absolutely. So there is a model of acculturation, which is essentially when a minority interacts with a wider community. And this is across the board. So this is if it's, you know, a Latin person, a Black person, an Irish person, whoever. It's about how we interact with the world around us. And the model says there's 4 different forms of acculturation. The first is assimilation, and assimilation is often incorrectly used. Assimilation is when you shed your identity. So people talk about the assimilated American Jew. Often the Jews that they're actually talking about are not assimilated because they didn't shed their Jewishness. They're the next one, they're integrated. And integration is when you try to have kind of the hyphenated identity. American Jew, British Jew, you certainly kind of go into the community, but you keep your distinct identity to an extent. Then there is one called marginalization, which is really, I've only met one person in the world who's ever like this, and it's when you reject your identity and the majority identity. It's a very strange.
So what are you then? Because that's what I was wondering when I read that in the book. I wonder what you are.
Precisely. You kind of are identityless, or you have something else. I had a former student who did that, and he was a Chinese boy who rejected Chinese culture, and he didn't take to American culture, which is the culture of our school. He was obsessed with the Vikings. And so I don't know what he identifies as, but he's the only person in the world I've ever known who does that. Because then that's very rare, because most of us will belong to one community or another. And then the last one is, I think if I remember correctly, it's called separatism. It's when you live in the wider world, but you live separately. So let's look at the American Jewish communities who say live in Brooklyn, these Jewish communities who certainly live in New York City, but they do live kind of more insulated Jewish lives. And what we have seen, or really because integration is very difficult, we have seen Jews not do a very good job of it. And that's not to blame them. As I said, it's not an easy thing to do, because when you're a minority, you're interacting with this bigger world that you're not an equal player in. You're not going and you're not having an equal conversation with the American non-Jewish world and the Jewish world, right? They're not equal players. One is enormously powerful and one is an immigrant, one's a refugee, one is a tiny community. So often what Jews do is that we shed integral aspects of our Jewishness, not our whole Jewishness, but really major aspects to be accepted. So we warp ourselves, we change ourselves to be accepted, all the while maintaining some Jewish identity, but we're never accepted. So these enormous warping of our identities, don't result in anything positive for us, and B, all they do is lead us to misunderstand ourselves. So it is possible to integrate, but we have to do it mindfully and thoughtfully to understand the pitfalls and the challenges.
I like what you said about acceptance just now, and I want to read a quote from your book. It's on page 132 for anybody that has the book, and it said, however, by the way, I need new glasses here, so bear with me, okay? These are just readers, Ben. I need to make it to Hong Kong because you've got great frames in Hong Kong, as I very well know. So it's on page 132 at the bottom. However, we can't disregard the fact that acceptance based on guilt is a dangerous thing. When the guilt disappears, so does the acceptance.
Absolutely.
That was a big light bulb moment for me.
Wow. Yeah, it's totally true. And I think that is what we've seen post-war. You know, the world, I say the first sentence of the book, the non-Jewish world hates Jews. And I stand by that. That does not mean the non-Jewish world wants to murder Jews. It doesn't mean that people are not shocked or we're not shocked with the Holocaust. The world was stunned. The world was stunned that this type of thing could happen in Europe in the middle of the 20th century, even if the governments all knew about it. And it really led over the next 20 or so years, particularly in America, but also in other places, for there to be kind of a rolling back of legal anti-Jewish racism. And there also was a trend where we saw overt anti-Jewishness become taboo. You could no longer openly say, I hate those Jews, because people would say, but 6 million Jews were just murdered. What are you talking about? So it went underground, and that was really partly because of guilt. But what we're seeing now in the 2020s, I guess that's what we're in, 2021s, people are starting not to feel guilty anymore. Because feeling guilty, for the non-Jewish world to feel guilty towards the Jews is very uncomfortable, because the non-Jewish world hates Jews. So they're caught in this cycle of feeling guilty, but then they don't want to feel guilty because there's still enormous amounts of racism towards us, and it's so deeply embedded. So what we're seeing now is the guilt disappear. And that's why one of the reasons we're starting to see overt anti-Jewishness kind of become more mainstream. Not even just comments about Israel that we know are dog whistles, comments about Jews. People are no longer trying to hide it. People feel able to actively question and attack Jewish people in a way they wouldn't have done 20 years ago. And that's because guilt is disappearing.
I want to talk about Jewish nationhood in a second. And there was a question that I had about some points that you're raising in the book. But I want to ask you about geographies though now, because as you know, I lived in Asia for 16 years, all over China and Singapore. And I will say the amount of times that I faced any anti-Semitism, I did face it, but it wasn't as virulent as certainly in the West, but it was few and far between. And there was a great deal of respect for Jewish people throughout what I would call the Confucian world. Japan, Korea, China, where I live, Singapore, certainly, right? Singapore and Israel have very strong, both diplomatic and military ties, and travels to India, etc. That part of the world, you don't experience that kind of anti-Semitism. In my travels through Africa as well, I never really experienced it to the extent that I've experienced it in the West. So can you just talk about the geography of anti-Semitism and that manifestation, because clearly there are swaths of the world where, yes, anti-Semitism exists, but it's not to the extent that it exists in the West.
No, I think that's a really excellent question, because you're right. And living here, I use the phrase the non-Jewish world, because I don't want to indict non-Jewish people. I think it's wholly irresponsible for movements to talk about people. So I think when, again, the Black Lives Matter organization talks about white people, I think I don't agree with that. So that's why I say non-Jewish world. But you're right. It's not as specific as maybe it could be. And really what we mean is the Muslim world and the Christian / culturally Christian world. Because this is there is no former Muslim world. The Muslim world is the Muslim world, and the countries that identify as Muslim and have Islam as a state religion are quite strong about that. Whereas with regards to Christianity, because we had the Enlightenment, you have countries that are culturally Christian, but may identify as officially secular. So that really is Europe, parts of Africa because of colonialism and how Christianity was spread there and Islam was spread there, North America and South America. So you're right, Asia is the exception to this. And the reality is that with regards to Christianity and Islam, those identities, those religions were built in opposition to Jews. Their ideas of Jews were used to define what it meant to be an early Christian and an early Muslim. And that became just embedded in their kind of ideological foundations. So that is why we see it in North America, particularly in Europe, which obviously was the home of kind of state religion with regards to Christianity and the Vatican and all of these things, and also places like South America, because it has just become embedded in those cultures. You're right with regards to Asia, it's much less virulent. I have experienced it in Hong Kong, but I've only experienced it really from other foreigners, from other expats. Although we saw something during the Hong Kong protests, which was very fascinating. So as I said, the world defines its identity using Jews, using their idea of Jews. And we often see them using their concept of Jewish victimhood to define their victimhood, which is why we see constant comparisons to the Holocaust, because if something is like the Nazis, then the victims in that situation are like the Jews. During the Hong Kong protests, we saw a very fascinating phrase emerge, which was China-Nazi, which was a portmanteau of China and Nazi. And it was really obviously saying the Chinese were Nazis. So in that situation, who are the protesters? Well, they're the Jews. So that was fascinating. And I think that took place because of social media, because culture now has no boundaries, it has no barriers. We're seeing so much cross-contamination, and that can be a beautiful thing, as I said, but also it can lead these very kind of nefarious trends to be transported all around the world. So that was something I saw that was very interesting. But you're right, Asia in general is much, like I wear my kippah every day and I'm never worried about it. So it's much easier to be Jewish here.
Yeah, when I lived in China, I was a trained China specialist, and I always felt a great affinity towards the Chinese people because, as we know, Jews and Chinese both have similar values: education, family, hard work. We're both ancient peoples with long literary traditions. So I felt a great affinity. And then when I moved to Singapore, I also felt a great sense of a renewal in my Jewish pride, if you will, because Singapore is a multiracial, multi-ethnic society where everybody is told to celebrate your ethnicity. That Singapore, there's a song, one of the national songs, I won't sing it for you, but is one people, one nation, one Singapore. Okay, that's one of their national songs. So everyone is encouraged to celebrate who they are. When I got there, I was like, well, who am I? I'm Jewish, And so I'd always had a Jewish identity, but I think it became even stronger when I got to Singapore. So I'm totally with you on that. We do have a question. I want to talk about Jewish nationhood in a second. And we do have a question here. And bear with me as I read it because it's really small print. It's in the chat. It comes from Mary Shelton. Thanks so much, Mary, for that. And she writes here, and I'm going to read it for everyone's benefit. So if gay pride is going to provide a model for Jewish pride, then Jews will be more quote unquote out. Jews will not try to fit in with non-Jewish culture because, because Jewish culture and Jewish values are not only equal in many respects, they're better, according to Mary. So of all our culture and values, what would we lead with?
Oh,
that's a really great question, Mary. Really great question. That might be for Ben's book number 2.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's exactly what you're saying. We're more out, we're more open, we're less afraid. We are willing to be members of our wider societies, but not to the detriment of our Jewishness. And I think, this is going to be a bit of a cop-out, and I promise you it's not meant in that way. We lead with whatever is natural to us. I think there are certain things that we as a people should be cultivating, which is historical knowledge of our own experiences, familiarity with Jewish traditions and Jewish text. And again, not necessarily in a religious way. I'm not telling everyone to go to yeshiva, but I do think we have to understand where we came from, and that's where that answer lies, right? But I think we create a space for everyone to practice the Jewishness that they feel most comfortable with. So for me, I wear my kippah. And again, as we said, it's kind of easier for me to do it in Hong Kong than it is in other places. But I wear my kippah because I want people to know that I'm a proud Jew. I know other people who are Shomer Shabbat, other people who say would maybe go to synagogue more often. Obviously, Zionism is a huge part of our Jewish identity. So I think
creeds in Israel with JNF.
Precisely. So we lead with all of those. We lead with it, which is whatever kind of is natural to us. But I think when we interact with the wider world, we have to have clear boundaries. And it kind of this full circle back to the beginning. We do not let people define who we are. We define what Zionism means. We define what Jewishness means. And to do that, we have to have these conversations internally. So it's really about us having conversations. Okay, so what is important? What to you is important about being Jewish? Do you like the Shabbat candles? Do you keep kosher? For me, those might not be so important, but I do other things. And it's not that we get to pick and choose things from the air. That's not what I'm saying. I see it as like an upside down hat. And there's lots of different bits of paper. And on these bits of paper are written aspects of Jewish practice, Jewish action, Jewish identity. And each of us get to dive into our own little hat and choose. And I think that is what it's about. And somebody once said to me, we have LGBTQ plus pride. We have a month, right? It's just been. Are we going to have Jewish Pride Month? And I was like, no, we don't really need that, because we have our pride moments. We have Rosh Hashanah. We have Sukkot. We have Pesach. We have Shavuot. We have Shabbat. We have these moments built into our calendars to celebrate our Jewishness, to express and embody Jewish pride in a way that's real and tangible.
We have Jewish Pride once a week, right?
Yeah.
For
Awesome.
Shabbat. And then plus
sure.
all the Hagim. I really like that, Ben. Going back to something that you just said, when I meet someone in the outside world, I want them to know me as a person. We can chat, where are you from, your interests, what you do, etc. I don't have to tell them off the bat, hi, my name's Stephen and I'm Jewish, right? Because if it comes up in conversation or if it's relevant, then that's perfectly fine. And I'm very proud of it. Sometimes it does come up within the first 2 minutes because they say, what do you do? I host the One Way Ticket Show podcast, and I host the IsraelCast podcast for Jewish National Fund. Well, they're going to kind of put two and two together and assume that I'm Jewish. And then the conversation talks all about Israel and goes to Israel and the cool stuff that's going on in Israel. So for me, that conversation happens sooner rather than later. But if someone just meets Stephen, they're not going to know if I'm Jewish necessarily off the bat. And so I think it's very important that people get to know you as a person, and then the Jewish part can come out, and then that's where the conversation can begin. I want to go back to something that you talked about in your book, because it was still a really big question mark for me then, and I want you to explain it. And that's this notion of when this wave of immigrants came to the United States, that they dropped, in many cases, they dropped Jewish nationhood, but kept the Jewish religion, right? Did I get that right? Did you articulate that in the book? Can you explain that to me? Because that was a huge question mark for me.
Absolutely. So it wasn't a trend that started in the United States. It was a trend that started in post-Enlightened Europe. And again, the French literally said to the French Jews, they said, and I quote, "We will afford the Jews nothing as a collective, but everything as an individual. We will not tolerate a nation within a nation. And if they want to live here, then they have to basically do what we're saying. And if not, we'll expel them." It was a similar thing in Germany. You had to become German. So what did that mean at that point? It meant not living in a segregated community. It meant speaking German, not speaking Yiddish or Hebrew. And that's really, in Germany at that time, we started to see the destruction of Yiddish as a language long before the Holocaust in Germany. when American, and I don't even really like to use the word immigrants, and I find it interesting that Americans do. These were refugees. These were Jews fleeing pogroms. When the refugees went to the United States, particularly at the end of the 19th century, we're speaking specifically about those Jews, not the Sephardic Jews who came previously, but the Ashkenazi Jews, they were met with this opportunity to enter a new world that they thought was free, or they hoped was free of what came before. And they adopted a similar thing. They said, particularly with reference to the Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights guarantees religious freedom. And they thought, okay, this is a way for us to be protected. This is a way for us to integrate and really take to our new world. So we're going to continue being Jews. We're not assimilating, we're integrating, but we're going to shed and warp aspects of our identity, which is what already happened in Europe. So we see this nationhood element kind of dissipate and fall away, which means that the Jews identify as a religious group, as opposed to what we are, which is a people, a nation, a civilization, and of course a religion, but not exclusively so. And this was really epitomized by the 1896 Pittsburgh Platform, which was the Reform Rabbis Conference, and they said, we reject calls to establish a Jewish state. And I found that to be fascinating in my research, because that was after the Russian pogroms. So Jews were, the first wave of Aliyah to Israel, the land of Israel, had already started. So I found it to be, in all honesty, enormously callous. And it was this idea of like, okay, we're here, we're in America, we have an opportunity to be safe here, so we're going to do what we have to make it work. And that meant, as we saw in Europe, shedding aspects of identity, because we are a nation.
Yeah,
but we don't think so.
I think maybe I was getting caught up on that word nation, because
Yes.
I was thinking to myself, you know, when my grandfathers came from Eastern Europe to the United States, they probably wanted to get the hell out of there just
Sure.
to be able to practice their Judaism, to be able to put food on the table, to have a better life for themselves and their families. They weren't thinking about the Jewish nation. They were just thinking about, I just want to get the hell out of there.
Absolutely.
So I can't, you know, so maybe I was just getting caught up on that word nation, if you will, because I think a lot of people actually, after they came to the United States, of course, they even just said they were just done with Judaism as a practice, you know, and there's so many people that say, well, I'm Reformed. Well, they're not Reformed. They're just not practicing, right?
Yeah.
So that's all semantics. But, you know, as I said in our interview, I love what the Lubavitcher Rebbe had said, that labels are for clothes, because we're all Jewish. It doesn't matter what's part of the spectrum you're on. If you're Jewish, you're Jewish. But that
Absolutely.
whole notion of nationhood, I think, needs to be underscored, that we are a nation, we are an ethnicity, and we are a religion. When you were writing about it in the book, like I said, that was a big question mark for me, because I really wondered if people even gave it thought when they were coming to the United States, or they were going to Britain, that they were part of a nation. They just wanted to get, as I said, the hell out of there. Now, I want to go to two.
Sorry, I'm just going to say one more thing about nationhood, because I think you're right. And I do think that we misunderstand it from a modern context, because back then it meant something quite different. It really was about belonging and not being a foreigner. It wasn't about having a hyphenated identity. And you're right, it's not that every single Jewish person came and was like, I am now no longer a part of the Jewish nation. But I guess what we're talking about is kind of cultural shifts and trends that were taking place at the time. And we do see, I mean, there are many American Jews today who just think, oh, I'm Jewish by religion. And you're right. That is not illegitimate, but it's not the whole story. And while one may really feel closely connected to the religion, we cannot disregard the rest. Just as you feel really close to the nationhood, you cannot disregard the religion. We have to really understand the fullness of our identity.
I know some Jews that they'll say they're Jewish, and I'm thinking of one in particular. He's probably been to a synagogue maybe 3 times in his life, you know.
Yeah.
Doesn't fast on Yom Kippur and on, but if you say, well, I'm Jewish. So there you go. I want to get to our questions. I was looking in the chat, but I realized we have 2 questions, and I want to thank Judah Rosen and also an anonymous attendee for a question. And Judah writes in, am I hearing the moderator correctly, calling out the anti-Semitism of the left and not of the right? So because I do want to address, there's anti-Semitism on both sides. I think that, you know, I mean, I have to tell you, I personally grew up with a lot of it on the right. So for me, that was kind of a given that it exists. And I had never seen it before on the left until these last few years. But I want you to address, for you to address that, because it does exist on the right, of course, too.
For sure. I think this is particularly an American conversation about the polarization, the politicization of anti-Jewish hate. When I talk about it on the left, I'm talking about it on the left. I'm not then excluding it on the right. I'm not saying it doesn't exist on the right. I'm talking about it specifically on the left because that's what Jeremy Corbyn was. And that's where that statement came from. And we have to understand that we are allowed to talk about things quite specifically, and leftist anti-Jewish hate has specific manifestations. Saying that, of course, it exists on the right. But I think what you said with regards to that is true, that it's more apparent, it's more obvious. We're all very familiar with that. There is nobody denying that right-wing anti-Jewish hate exists. That doesn't happen. Everyone acknowledges it, everyone understands the threat the right faces to Jewish people. That is not the case with regards to the left. Let's again refer back to the article that was written by a certain Jewish leader in the United States a couple of weeks ago that said, now is the time to recognize left anti-Jewish hate, which quite frankly, I find it so humiliating and embarrassing that that person thought 2021 was the time to do that. It exists all over the political spectrum. I'm not saying it's worse on the left. I'm not saying it's worse on the right. It's everywhere. But we have to recognize that it exists on the left. And that is where we're starting from, because many, many people don't. So of course, we're going to speak about it specifically. And if we were speaking about, the march in Charlottesville that said the Jews will not replace us, I think a few years ago, I forget the exact year, we're going to speak specifically about right-wing anti-Jewish hate. And I do think Americans need to understand that while you experienced a majority of anti-Semitism you experienced was right-wing, it's literally the opposite in the UK. The vast majority that I've ever experienced is from the left. So what we're doing is just trying to get people to recognize that it exists in equal measure on all parts of the political spectrum, and we have to recognize that.
Yeah, it's very funny because without going into, I can talk to you about this offline. While, as a child and growing up, I could tell it was from the right, but as an adult, I personally have experienced it from the left. So, and a whole other thing. And also, anyway, on a professional level, I've experienced it, but that's a whole other story, everybody. Anonymous attendee, and it's a similar question. What are your thoughts about the conservative right comparing political issues to the Holocaust, acting as if they are victims of a similar situation?
Yeah, I think it's crazy. And what they're doing is using, again, the concept of Jewish victimhood to define their victimhood. So if people say, forcing me to wear a mask is like the Holocaust, what they're doing is framing themselves as victims, which is a 2,000-year-old, or rather, they're framing themselves as victims and they're using Jewish identity to do that, which is a 2,000-year-old trend. So I think it's abhorrent. I think that we should condemn it. I think that it diminishes the seriousness of the Holocaust. It's some kind of soft Holocaust denial, because it totally just diminishes what makes the Holocaust unique amongst world events and either other genocides. So I think we should absolutely call out anti-Jewish hate wherever and whenever we see it. And there's some people who don't agree with me and say, no, we shouldn't call it out from other minorities. That's not something I share. I think we call it out wherever and whenever we see it. And it doesn't matter if that person's on the left, doesn't matter if it's on the right, doesn't matter whatever. We have a responsibility to advocate for ourselves across the board.
Right. Well, we want to thank everybody for your questions. And Karen wrote in, I wish you'd rethink your statement about Reform Jews not practicing Judaism. We need to be careful not to alienate anyone who identifies as Jewish and respect our different ways of practicing our Judaism. Karen, with all due respect, I don't think either one of us was saying that Jews are not practicing Judaism if they're Reform. I don't think you did, Ben, and certainly I didn't. In fact, what I said was that I love what the Lubavitcher Rebbe had said, that labels are for clothes, right? Is that if you're Jewish, and you can do whatever you want. And what you were talking about, Ben, also, but I'll let you answer, Karen, is that, it's like putting the hat upside down and have all the little pieces of paper in the hat, and you can select your Judaism. So go for it.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Karen. I think we have to be very careful not to alienate and not to create a hierarchy of Jewishness. And I think that is what we often see. We see people doing that across the board. We see sometimes it happen in the Orthodox world. We see it happen in the progressive world, like I'm a better Jew than you because. And we have to be
respectful. Very dangerous to do that.
Yeah, we have to be respectful of each other's right to practice our Jewishness in whatever way we see fit. And even if that's not the way that we do it. I grew up in a Reform synagogue, so I feel in many ways quite attached to Reform Judaism. And I think we should make space for all different types of Jews. I totally agree.
Right. Okay. And Steve Goldstone, thank you for weighing in. Judaism is based on God, Torah, and Israel.
Yeah, listen, I think you're right, and I think that I read a really interesting article a couple of days ago for researching my new book, and it was about non-Zionists. And I want to specifically refer to the Israel section of what you've said, because I think you're totally right. God, Torah, and Israel, those really are the basis of what it means to be Jewish. You're absolutely right. But I think we also have to accept that some Jews may feel closer to one aspect of that. So for me, I'm really, really connected to Israel. I'm a really diehard Zionist. It's really, really important to me. The God element is less important to me personally, but it doesn't mean that we erase it. It doesn't mean we diminish it. And it doesn't mean that we would say criticize other Jews for having a different relationship with those three tenets of our peoplehood. And you're right. I think those are probably the three tenets of what it means to be Jewish.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Steve. And then Sivia writes in, also important to note that the reform movement in the UK is very different than in the United States. And she writes, hi, Ben.
Hi, Sivia. Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, Britain is more, the British Jewish community is more traditional for sure. So it's pretty commonplace I grew up in a reform household, but we had separate cutlery. We had separate plates. We had our Pesach dishes upstairs. It was quite traditional, and that was kind of the standard. I'm not entirely sure what it's like now, but yeah, the American reform and British reform is quite different for sure. I would agree with that.
So, okay, yeah, because I don't know if those in the reform movement would go to that length, if you will.
Yeah.
For holidays. So I think you're right. And again, everyone has their own level of observance, right? And we want to embrace everyone's level of observance and the beauty within that, right? Phyllis wrote in, and I'm going to paraphrase, it's a really, really nice paragraph that she wrote, how the average non-Jewish person in most non-urban areas in foreign countries probably does not personally know any actual Jews, which I think you're spot on, Phyllis. And then at the very end of what she wrote is that we need to change. The media has a bias which now portrays Israel as apartheid and is the aggressor, with the underdog being championed. People feel being anti-Semitic is righteous, according to Phyllis. And if you want to address that.
So yeah, the question I would ask is, well, how do we get people to change the media bias? Mm-hmm. Why would they want to?
That's your job, Ben. You're all over the media, right?
We get them to do that by feeling pride, because Jewish pride tells us that we're allowed to advocate for ourselves. We're allowed to say, no, the way you're treating us is wrong. So actually pride, they're not separate. It's very much part of the same process. We make people proud Jews, and then they are more aware of the world around us. They're more aware of the media bias. And what we do with regards to media bias is that we keep fighting back. With all honesty, I don't really think we're going to be able to make a dent, but it doesn't mean we don't fight, because it's our principle, and we're fighting because we know we should be treated better. But the only reason we know we should be treated better is if we have Jewish pride.
Right. Listen, Ben, I'm super mindful of the clock. We have just about 2 minutes left because we said that we were going to end close to the 8 o'clock mark here on the East Coast. So we might go over just for a minute or so. Have you eaten breakfast, by the way?
No, I've had a cup of coffee.
Okay, good. Well, listen, you've done awfully well for early in the morning with 1 cup of coffee. I owe you one when I make it to Hong Kong one of these days. I do want to wrap it up and just say, first of all, again, the book is amazing. Again, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People. I always keep wanting to call it Rebuilding a Nation, which in a way it is, but it's Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People. We still want to thank you. We want to remind everybody that's on the call here, just a couple of housekeeping points so nobody sign off yet. First thing is that, again, check out Ben's interview on the latest episode of IsraelCast, jnf.org/IsraelCast, or wherever you get podcasts, or it's episode 120 if you're listening to this or watching this like 5 years from now, because social media being the time space continuum that it is. Ben will also be part of the conversations of Zionism, about Zionism, that Russell Robinson is conversation on Zionism that Russell is going to be doing. I think you're coming on in the fall. It's a wonderful year-long program. And again, we want to get everyone involved and encouraged, because the program is really to reclaim the beauty, the inspiration, the diversity, the inclusivity. We underscore the word inclusivity of Zionism, and to be proud Zionists and to be proud Jews. So definitely more to watch out for that. And Ben, I do know that you're going to want to wake up again, once again at 7 o'clock in the morning to join us on August 25th, because what's happening on August 25th is our next session. Max Levin, Under the Stretcher, is our book, our featured book, August 25th. So everybody do sign up for that. And I think that's about it. Do you have any parting words, though, before we sign off and head off into the sunset, about whether your sense of Jewish pride, what you're most prideful about, or like the one thing that somebody can do is they're signing off today?
Yeah, I think that for me, I keep a pile of kippot by my front door.
Mhm.
And I try to match my kippah to what I'm wearing. And that reminds me every day.
Love the kippah you're wearing right now, by the way.
Thanks, yeah, it's a very big one. It's because for hair and makeup didn't arrive in time.
Yeah, it's got a visor on it.
Yes, but it reminds me every day that I'm Jewish. And that sounds like maybe quite a strange thing to say. Why do you need reminding that you're Jewish? I'm a Jew who lives in Hong Kong. I'm a minority here. I'm not necessarily identified by others as a Jew, which in some people like. I want to stand out. I want to be a proud Jew. And for me, the act of putting on my kippah is an action which reminds me that I'm a Jew, reminds me that I'm a proud Jew. So I would really encourage everyone, in whatever way is most comfortable for them, to do something at least once a day that reminds us that we're proud Jews, and reminds us that we are part of a beautiful tradition and peoplehood, and each of us represent a thread in a much greater tapestry of Jewishness that stretches back thousands of years, and we should honor that and celebrate it and live it.
And can I add just one more thing also? I love what you said about how there's Pride Month, but we have Pride Week every week, which is Shabbat.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that you have to go whole hog, pardon the pun, but if you have Shabbat dinner, okay, invite family, friends, people that are not Jewish engaged, that aren't Israel engaged, that might be Jewish, that aren't Jewish, to experience what a traditional Shabbat dinner is. I think it's such a beautiful way of showing the Jewish tradition, Jewish heritage, and to get other people involved in the Jewish people and in Israel and in Zionism. For me, I think it's a beautiful thing. Or if you want to do a Havdalah, right, on a Saturday night, and then you invite everybody over, and after Havdalah, you can all watch your favorite Netflix show together, do whatever you want, okay? So I think those are just some little things I think that people can do just for inspiration. Anyway, Ben, we've kept you over by 2 minutes. First of all, we want to thank everybody for joining us. Really, we have such a wonderful crowd. We thank everybody for writing in with your questions. And Ben, we thank you. I know this was our second conversation. We look forward to conversation number 3 with you. And we're going to do this until we get it right. How's that?
Exactly. Thank you for
anyway,
having me.
listen, thanks a million, Ben, and we'll see you soon. Take it easy.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.